Hi, it's Jessica Morgenthal from Resilience Gone Wild, where we explore how nature's quiet brilliance can help us care more deeply for ourselves, for each other, and for the wild world we all share. Today we're doing something a little different. We're returning to one of my favorite animals, the polar bear, and her story from season 1. These lessons feel especially meaningful during this time of year when seasons shift in different ways across the world, and many of us move into holidays, reflection, and new beginnings. Some parts of what you're about to hear may feel familiar. I hope you enjoy them even more the second time. I certainly did. This episode centers on one of my favorite resilience tools, going with the flow, the art of adapting, adjusting, and meeting change with steadiness, just as the polar bear does across a landscape that never stops moving. It is a lesson about trusting what shifts, responding with presence, and letting the path reveal itself one moment at a time. Before we step into my conversation with polar bear guru and wildlife photographer Daniel J. Cox, we'll revisit the story that sets the stage for everything he shares, a powerful reminder of what it looks like to move through uncertainty with presence and trust. Imagine standing on the vast, glistening Arctic ice, where the horizon is a seamless expanse of white and blue, stretching endlessly in every direction. The air is so cold it burns, a biting chill that wraps around you like a frozen embrace. The wind howls through the open expanse, relentless and fierce, sculpting ridges and valleys into the ice. Beneath your feet, the ground is never truly solid. The ice groans and shifts, cracking like the sound of ancient glaciers splitting apart. Everything here is in motion, a frozen river of change. Yet there's one creature that moves through this shifting wilderness as if it were an old friend: the polar bear. These magnificent creatures have evolved to not only survive, but to thrive in the Arctic's icy grip. Their thick, translucent fur is more than a coat. It's a shield of light and warmth, trapping heat in a natural insulation system that keeps them from freezing. Beneath the surface, their jet-black skin acts like a solar panel, soaking up every precious ray of sunlight, while their thick layer of fat, up to 4 inches deep, acts as a life raft, keeping them buoyant and insulated in frigid waters. But the polar bear's resilience is more than skin deep. Their story is a masterclass in adaptation. About 500,000 years ago, polar bears diverged from their brown bear ancestors, embarking on a slow, magnificent transformation that turned them into one of the most specialized mammals on Earth. Over time, they evolved into true marine hunters, blurring the line between land and sea. Their elongated skulls and streamlined bodies allow them to glide effortlessly through icy waters. Their massive webbed paws act as built-in paddles, propelling them through the sea with graceful efficiency. This perfect design has made them the silent hunters of the Arctic. Unlike their land-dwelling cousins, polar bears rely almost entirely on seals, particularly ringed and bearded seals, to survive. Their hunting strategy is a patient game, a dance with the ice. The bear finds a breathing hole, a small opening where seals surface for air, and then it waits, perfectly still, sometimes for hours. Its keen nose detects the faintest scent, its body motionless, blending with the frozen world. When the seal surfaces, the bear acts with the precision of a seasoned predator. One swift movement, a powerful strike, and the meal is secured. But food is only one part of the story. Polar bears are the Arctic's nomads, covering vast distances in search of sustenance, mates, and stable ice. Males, the largest of the species, will roam up to 1,000 miles a year, following the shifting pathways of the FLOEs. They are wanderers, charting a course across an ever-changing landscape, moving forward with quiet determination. Their journey isn't just about strength, it's about endurance. Polar bears are masters of energy conservation, understanding when to push forward and when to pause. They don't fight the current, they ride it. They don't swim endlessly against the waves. They use floating ice as stepping stones, resting when needed, conserving their energy for the right moment to act. They move through the Arctic like a river finding its way to the sea, never rigid, always adjusting, always flowing forward. And then there are the mothers. Their resilience is a different kind of strength, one rooted in stillness and sacrifice. As the Arctic winter settles in, a pregnant female begins her most challenging journey. She retreats into a den, carving out a safe haven in the snow, a place of warmth and stillness where she will bring new life into the world. She does not eat. She does not drink. She survives on the reserves she built in the months before. Inside the den, where the outside world is a frozen wilderness, her warmth is a heartbeat of survival. In the deepest dark of winter, her cubs are born, small, blind, helpless. They press into her warmth, listening to the steady rhythm of her breath. Her breath fills the den with life-giving warmth, a steady pulse of heat that keeps them safe. Her rich milk nourishes them, each sip filling them with the strength they will need for the journey ahead. And then, when the time is right, they emerge, stepping onto the ice for the first time. They stumble, they roll, they play, a rehearsal for the survival lessons to come. Every tumble teaches them balance. Every playful wrestle builds strength. Even in the harshest place on earth, there is room for joy. Hearing this story again, I'm struck by how much the polar bear's way of moving through the world mirrors what it means to be fully present, not pushing or forcing, not trying to control the ice beneath them, only responding to what the moment offers. That area becomes even more vivid when you hear from someone who has spent a lifetime watching and learning from animals in their own environment. Daniel J. Cox is a wildlife photographer whose work has taken him across some of the most breathtaking and unforgiving landscapes on Earth. What stands out most is not the places he has been. It is the way he sees, the patience, the humility, the curiosity, the willingness to step back and let the story reveal itself rather than trying to shape it. In our conversation, you will hear how awe guides his work, how waiting has taught him more than chasing ever could, and how disappearing from the narrative allows the truth of an animal or a landscape to come forward. His way of witnessing the natural world reminds us that resilience is not loud. It is attentive, steady, and responsive. Here is our conversation. Yay, welcome Dan Cox, Daniel J. Cox, in full title of an incredibly successful and impactful nature photographer. So welcome to Resilience Gone Wild.
Thank you.
So thrilled you're here. Having just gotten, I think, back from one of your crazy or wild expeditions to the tundra.
Yeah, we were in Norway for 4 weeks, and my goodness, it was very strange. Just, it was supposed to be lots and lots of snow, and we finally, our last week, we got some snow, but the first week we got there, we had snow, and then it warmed up so high that everything melted, and it rained for almost 2 weeks.
January in the Arctic. Have you ever experienced that before?
No, but you have to be careful a little bit because Norway it has the Gulf current that comes up through the north and actually makes that northern part of the Arctic warmer than we would expect. And that's by way of the current that comes up from the south. I believe it's called the Humboldt current. It's really easy to be in your own little world, especially if you don't get out and travel. And it's one of the things that I think is so important about travel is getting to see the other places around the planet and meet the people who live there. who have seen this stuff change and have experienced the changes that we're seeing here in the United States, in particular in Montana, where I live, a much warmer winters than normal. Although this winter we're having a pretty good solid winter, but it didn't start off that way.
Yeah, just to your point about meeting the people who have experienced life there for generations or millennium and have been the guardians. We walk in as travelers, but that those who need to care for the local ecosystem have been there forever. And we need to respect that and to talk to them and ask them for advice and learn from.
Yeah. No, that's important. But and that's one of the great things about traveling is it's so important to see other people's perspective and experience some of the things that we don't experience if we just stay in our own little community and don't go anywhere.
Yeah. Although I have, one of the things that really kind of blew my mind and I really embraced it is that you really only need a bit of nature as long as you look closely and you pay attention and you don't, being surrounded in large scale is magnificent. And you can see an ecosystem of that scale in action. If you look if you look at just a very small bit, there's so much going on there too.
There's so much going on. Yeah, it's an astonishing array of creatures and animals that one of the things that I am regularly reminded, even though we have lost so much here in the United States and North America since the settlers came across and basically exterminated the bison and lots of other animals. We still have a lot, but it is kind of sad. I did a shoot in Tanzania. I guess it was 10, 12 years ago. And the main reason I went was to catch the migration of the wildebeest in the southern part of Tanzania. And the reason for it was because I was hoping to see what I was told were 3 million animals. And I've always wondered what millions of animals would look like. What we had here in North America at one time, there are here the figures anywhere from 35 to 65 million bison. Now that's a pretty big stretch in difference, but even if it was 35 million bison, it's just staggering to think of the numbers that must have been if you could only see that, let alone imagine it. And the thing that's so discouraging and kind of sad is that people don't, if something's gone and they've never experienced it, they don't really miss it. And so it's one of the things that I try to remind myself of is, even though I feel like we have a lot of wildlife here in North America, I can only imagine what it was like when the first settlers came across, and they likened it to Africa. In fact, the plains of North America were likened to the Serengeti, and that would, I read about wolves and bison and elk and all the things that, most of those things have moved to the mountains because we've settled the plains.
Right. It's interesting. You remind me of, I've heard that polar bears are often mentioned as a key species that people will notice if they're gone. At least for now, your life's focus is heavily around the survival of the polar bears and their environments. It's a really important, powerful thing that it's a species that we will notice and that we do notice.
There is something different about polar bears. One is they're white, and there is something unique about white animals and white creatures that people are drawn to. Brown bears are every bit as cute, and black bears are incredibly cute, but they just don't get the same attention. And bears get a lot of attention in many ways because I think people have a tendency, this is kind of hard to imagine, but I was in a camp many, many years ago. It's probably 30 years ago, a black bear camp where they had killed a couple of black bears and they had skinned them and they're hanging from a pole. Now, this is hard to describe. It was back when I was young and I had some friends in my life that love to hunt, and I'm not against hunting if you're doing it for meat and putting food on the table, but I don't understand why anybody shoots a bear. But anyway, that's different for me today. But they look so human as far as their body makeup and their muscles, and there's something about bears that, and then on top of that, they're very, very smart. Just because they can't speak to us as far as a language that we understand, we think that they're,
that we understand.
Yeah,
perfect
that we understand.
Point, right?
Yeah, and exactly. I mean, we're holding them to a level that just because we don't understand it doesn't mean it's not there. And there's been so much good information in the last 20, 30 years on this different sounds that whales make and other animals make, that they have actually been able to decipher as languages. And who knows what they're saying about us,
right? It's such a good point, to speak the language of every other species. And we need to go to places like that. We need to connect with people like that who are speaking the language or understanding the language. And many of them have learned to sort of participate, and practice being in their language.
Animals have so much more going on than we give them credit for. Being at the top of the food chain and having a brain that allows us to create weapons and things that can harm them, and they have a difficult time getting away from, you start to really feel that there might be something else going on there that is really difficult to try and justify how we handle things, because they know what's going on.
So on that note, we haven't even introduced how awesome you are, and I don't want to miss that. First of all, okay, you can be humble if you want, and there's these beautiful National Geographic covers behind you, and I'm staring at this gorgeous owl staring back at me. So please just introduce yourself and share what you're contributing to our world, because you can put it that way. It's not about you, it's what you're contributing and your sense of purpose.
Appreciate that. And I think that for me, that's really important. It's not about me. So many places I go anymore, I see people going to those places and then having to get in front of the camera to show people themselves in this magnificent area. And my feeling is, get out of the way. That's not what's important. It's what's behind you that is important. I get so frustrated with that. And believe me, I was just in Norway where, the selfie crowd is just so tough to handle, because it's not about you. It's about this incredibly beautiful backdrop that we have and why it's so special. So I started as a young photographer. I mean, my father mentioned earlier, my father and I spent a lot of time as a young boy hunting and fishing, and started out in the state of Washington, where I was born and raised until I was about 8. We moved to northern Minnesota at about 9 years old, and I grew up on a little tiny farm, hobby farm, and wanted to get back west as I grew up. I loved the mountains, and so I ended up in Montana, where I'm at now, and I've been here since 1987. But Dad loved photography, but raising 5 kids, he didn't have a lot of money to, back in those days, my goodness, the amount of costs that we incurred taking pictures with film and process, and then having to process it.
It was so funny. I just have to say, it was so funny. I was watching an interview that you had done, and you asked the other person if they knew what film was. And I really feel like there are things that, like, my kids know what a rotary phone is because I've shown them, and hopefully they know what film is, but it's like a completely different world. Every picture we took mattered because you had to pay for it to be developed, and you only had so much. Yeah. Like, you brought the big bag of film with you, and you hoped it didn't get ruined in the x-ray machines, right?
Yeah, you're right. You're dead on. You've had some photography in your blood. I can hear it. Yes, absolutely. That was a big deal back in the 80s and 90s when I was, up until about 2004 when I switched over to digital. But yeah, that was a big deal. But learning from my father, the important thing, I didn't learn my photography from my father, although he did inspire me with a camera that he had, and I got to use when I was around the house. I wanted to start taking pictures for my school newspaper, and I played sports, and my buddies wanted pictures of him in the sports. And and when I asked him if I could take it to school, he said, "No, you can't take it to school. If you want to take it to school, you got to buy your own." All right. Well, my sister and I had a 1968 GTO. It's what I look back on and hear about, and it wasn't running right, and I wasn't a car guy. We just happened to buy this thing together. Anyway, long story short, we sold it. I took my $500 and bought a camera. And then that kind of started me on my way into the world of photography. But the fact that I had spent so much time in nature, hunting and fishing with my father, guided me to this interest in taking pictures of animals.
What was it that we were thinking in the moment of wanting to take the picture? Like, because you just said, which is a big issue today, people are taking selfies so that they can post it and they can be cool. It's not about what's in the background. It's about the fact that they were there in the background. So actually, I've never asked this. Like, what is it that was the draw to wanting to take the picture?
I think that's a good question. I think it's the challenge originally for me as a young, 16-year-old photographer. I think of the first time I went out with a telephoto lens and a camera and tried to get pictures of white-tailed deer on this farm that we lived on in northern Minnesota. And I believe, it had to do with a challenge. The other thing is I love animals. So it was a challenge to like get closer to them and be closer to their lives. I loved, we had dogs growing up, we had horses, and animals were really special. I mean, they just interested me. And so this idea of sitting down in the field and knowing that they came out late in the afternoon, early evening, and maybe if I just was quiet enough and kind of sat tight enough that they wouldn't be too fearful and maybe give me a chance to take their picture. And so there's a couple of things going on there. One is the challenge, and that's what photography. I mean, a lot of people.
And by the way, that's a big part of purpose, right? Like I teach about purpose, and in purpose, you have to have and flow. There has to be some challenge. If it's too easy or too hard, it's not you need the sweet spot that makes you feel like you've accomplished something, because that's what a human need is.
And that goes back to kind of what I was saying earlier, is that humans, I mean, in a perfect world, we'd all just stand around and appreciate this stuff. But we as humans go, oh God, maybe I could catch one of these fish, or maybe I could do, at least with photography, if you're not bothering the animals, and that's such an important part of wildlife and nature photography is respecting the animals, respecting their distance that they need to be from you, typically understanding that getting the picture is not the be all end all. That's one of my biggest pet peeves is, whatever it takes to get the picture, not in wildlife and nature photography. I mean, if you want to do that in the war zone, all right, maybe you'll win a Pulitzer. I'll never win a Pulitzer with a white-tailed deer picture, but
polar bear.
Huh?
You might with a polar bear.
I don't know.
Because there's a story like that. I think the point to me, what I'm hearing is, it's about the story that is captured and the urgency versus honoring nature and not disturbing it. The urgency of sharing the story. And I feel like, it's a complex combination of the challenge plus the respect plus honoring them by telling their story to others who aren't there.
That's the biggest thing for me, is that animals, we talked, again, this segues back into what we talked about earlier, is that they can't speak.
Well, they can, but we can't hear them.
Yeah, we don't understand it. And maybe if they could whisper in our ear, a cute little polar bear could, come up and not, attack us when we got him cuddled in our arms. If we could whisper in our ears what is going on in their life and how we might be able to, it might have an effect on us, but they can't. So they go on, doing their thing almost like, mutes, and we don't relate to it. So it's telling that story that has become important to me. And again, today in our world today, where a lot of people have become photographers just because they have a phone in their hand now. It's disappointing for the wrong reasons, it seems, for many, not everybody. But when I see it constantly, that it's about them in the environment as opposed to whatever the environment is. And that's what I cherish. And man, there's nothing, I appreciate more than going to these special places and not wanting to be a part of it as the main subject, but be a part of it to just show why it's so special.
To be in it. Not to be in it. So I'd love to hear the rest of your story. So you were taking pictures. The goal was you started by capturing the beauty and the brilliance of nature that existed on your farm, the white-tailed deer. And so go forth with that story, because it's important. Your story is important.
Well, it was a beginning challenge for me in my photography, where I started to understand why it was so difficult to get good pictures of these animals. And I mean, whitetails are pretty pretty common, but where I was living at the time, they were still, and they still are today, hunted extensively. And so they're wary. The places that you can spend time getting closer to them are state parks, national parks, that kind of thing, where they're not hunted. But early on in my career, it became really evident that it wasn't easy to get pictures of these guys. And so the challenge and then the desire to tell that story just kept on growing with importance, and the desire to go do this became a driving force. And then I came to realize that, the white-tailed deer is not an animal that is endangered or has, it is doing really well across our country in North America. A lot of it because they have adapted to being able to coexist with humans in rural areas. And so they're not a species that's at risk, but it started to dawn on me that there are other animals that are every bit as difficult to capture pictures of that could or are at risk, could be or are at risk. That's where the story comes in of wanting to share that with people that, my God, these things are really amazing. Can you imagine what if they weren't here? I mean, that's what happened to the bison are still here, but the numbers of them, that's what happened to the numbers that we used to have here in North American, on the North American plains. So I can't imagine. I mentioned earlier that if you've never experienced it, if you've never experienced a polar bear, being close to a polar bear. And when I say close, respectable distances that I work, or from within, vehicles or things that protect you so that the bear doesn't get in trouble. And that's such an important part of the whole thing, because you're working with animals that you want to elevate to a level of interest for people, that they get excited, and that it's important that you not become part of the story by all of a sudden getting involved with them in a negative way. And I do everything I can, and I don't have any good dangerous bear stories. It's amazing how many.
That's good.
I know it. I say that. I can't tell you how often I'm interviewed, and they say, "Well, have you got any really good, close encounters?" And I go, I really don't. And because I work really hard to stay out of that situation, because if I don't, and a bear gets a hold of me or does something negative to me, and I'm lucky enough to live, the bear will be probably destroyed. So yeah, I'm kind of boring from that perspective. People want to hear about close calls, and
to me, that I honor that, to say the least. So
I appreciate it.
We're in alignment on that. Yeah. But you make an important point, which is not where we're going to specifically go with this, but it is a huge issue in our human world today, that with so much more interaction with nature, with wild animals, because we've taken so much of their land and their habitat and taken it and changed it. Agricultural land, development, all of it, changed the water systems, changed everything, that the answer is always, it seems to be, I don't know, always, I hate to use the word always or never, but it is more often than not, the animal species loses. The animal loses in any interaction, no matter whose fault it was.
That's right. That is virtually almost always true.
Including in a zoo, when somebody goes into a zoo,
we've heard those stories
too many times. Yeah.
The animal pays the price. Yep. I've got some thoughts on that, but
so like in terms of the bottom line of this part of the story is whoever's listening, like just keep this in mind when you're interacting with animals. Like you don't need to be in the story. The story is really good by itself without you, right? Like a picture of a polar bear is actually more exciting without you in it, and that you are risking their survival by getting too close and interacting, because they will be the ones who pay the price, as you said. So, always keep that in mind.
Yeah. The animals, you're right. They virtually always lose if something happens where we, as stupid humans, do something they correct us on.
Yeah.
Okay.
So keep going. Sorry.
That's how I got into wildlife photography. And then I started thinking, really wanting to be part of the answer in getting people interested in making sure that we always have these things around and basically save them or encourage conservation and understanding how we can live with these animals and still have them as part of our lives in the many areas that we have in the United States. And so that was the inspiration to start working with. Back in the days when I was really working hard to make a living at this, I was working with, National Wildlife Federation, Audubon, the Sierra Club, all the big conservation groups, and helping them, offering pictures of these animals to help tell the story as to why it was important that their missions of saving habitat, saving specific animals themselves. And most of it comes down to habitat, to be honest. I don't know, a lot of people don't really think of that, but if the habitat is there, the animals almost always will repopulate and come back.
I mean, that's like the salmon runs. Like I think you were talking about before. I'm not sure if that was the fish you were talking about, but when the salmon run rivers were reopened recently and people left the space alone, the repopulation was just unbelievably fast, right?
Yep. They're already seeing, I think you're referring to some dams in particular in California that were taken out, and the salmon are back able to start spawning up those rivers again. And so it's all about habitat. And part of the problem is that we humans like that habitat ourselves. So we just have to figure out ways to share it. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of habitat, I dug a little bit, like Polar Bear International, which you're very involved with, protects not just the polar bear, but to that point, like these nature organizations are not focused only on the species, the animal species, but on fauna, flora, fungi, phenomena. Like that's my fourth sounds that I like. Yeah. And that you're focused on the sea ice survival that is an absolute requirement for the polar bears to survive. Like they don't live separately as two things to work on, right? We'll go with that. Yeah.
Well, the reason for it is polar bears it's absolutely essential. They earn their living on the sea ice because that's where the seals are. Yeah. The seals give birth on the sea ice. They're big animals. Polar bear is a massive animal. Big males can have gotten recorded weights of up to 1,700 pounds and 10 to 12 feet high if they were standing up. So they require a lot of food. And in fact, this is one of the things that people hear about is, well, can't the polar bears they originally evolved from grizzly bears, which is a kind of a whole nother story. So at one time they roamed the land and fed on the land. Couldn't they do it again? Well, no. I mean, that it took them so long to evolve into a marine mammal, and that's what they are considered, a total marine mammal, that it takes a big prey item, which might be, their two favorites are the ring seal and the bearded seal. The bearded seal is big as 620 pounds. The ring seal quite a bit smaller at 120 pounds. But that's a lot of meat and a lot of fat. Ring seal has got a lot of fat on him, and that's typically what the polar bear is most interested in. If they're really hungry and have been without food for a long time, they will eat all the meat and the entire animal. But for the most part, I've seen polar bears where they just literally strip the fat and just eat the fat on the animal because it's
there's a plan, right? Like they know that they can only eat for a certain number of months, and then they have to have enough to reproduce, to hibernate, to do all that stuff for many months. So like they're pretty smart. They know exactly what they're looking for.
Yeah, that's right. There has been I've talked to some biologists that say digesting actual meat takes more calories than just digesting and consuming the blubber. So that's what they go for. And they need that. And the seals are very, very fat, and they're great food sources for these guys. And they can only catch them on the ice. Now, there's probably...
Well, I read it's because seals are faster than they are.
Seals are faster in the water. Yes, the seals are faster. Although I photographed, and I don't know how he caught it. It looked like it was a bearded seal that had come probably up on land, and he found it, snuck up on it and killed it because there was no ice at the time, and he was eating it on land. So they can capture animals on land, but in general, the seals will, stay out on the ice if they have ice, or stay on little islands and places where it's not as dangerous as normal the normal land that they might go to, which is another thing about the ice, is without that ice, again, it affects the seals and walrus and all the animals that actually live on the ice when it's there. And that's one of the things that we just don't hear much about, is there's not as many people studying seals as there are polar bears. And a big part of the reason is that seals are really tough to keep track of. They dip under the water and they're gone. And they're very, very hard to keep track of and find out, how they're doing. But it makes sense that if the seals don't have ice, that's another big part that's going to slip, is going to create big, big problems.
And to the end about the ice, like just to sort of respect the larger system of sea ice. And I just did a little digging about this, so I'm sure you know a lot more. Sea ice is not only there for the polar bears to sit on so that they can. It's so funny. Penguins just showed up on my screen. It's very odd, which I realize aren't up there in the Arctic. Yeah. So you've got baleen whales, I assume, that are eating a completely different type of food. And it's all part of the system. Like sea ice is not only for the largest of the animals. Right. There's other purposes to it, right?
Yeah, there is. A friend of mine who's a biologist, Jeff York, described it one time as an upside down triangle. When you look at the sea ice, if you're ever fortunate enough to get up, let's say to the Beaufort Sea in Alaska, where I've done a lot of work, or any of the sea ice in the Arctic, it looks barren. It's many places it's very flat. If it's not flat, it's got jumbled ridges and you don't see, if you're lucky, you might see a seal, you might see a polar bear, but we flew in helicopters when I was working with Dr. Stephen Anstrup on his research, on his polar bear research, that was used for designating polar bears as a threatened species. First species ever added to the threatened species list based on what they predict was going to happen. But Dr. Anstrup and I spent about 5 years documenting his work in the Beaufort Sea. And I remember, in a helicopter flying for miles and being able to see for tens of miles, not seeing anything. So it looks very barren and very lifeless out there until you run across the tracks of a polar bear. But if you're standing there, you're looking at the ice and you look at it and think, my goodness, how barren this is. Underneath that ice are the cod that feed on the plankton and the small animals that you described in your story and these little guys are called amphipods, not as small as the ones you are looking at, but very strange looking little critters like
I gotta look them up. Yeah.
The sea angel and some actual really interesting critters. But it's all, so it all comes, it's like a pyramid from the top and the pyramid going down, where it starts with the smaller critters, and then the fish eat the smaller critters, the seal eat the fish, the seal gets up on the ice, and the polar bear eats the seal. So it's just like this upside down triangle. And
it's the classic metaphor, right? Iceberg is an incredibly well-known metaphor that we need to really embrace for the depth of the nature of it, in that, what is it, like 90% of an iceberg is invisible, is underwater, right? So all we're seeing is the top, and if we pay attention to what the invisible part is, it's most of the story. It's most of the system, which is, can connect to the tardigrade. Like, we have no idea, because they're microscopic, that the tardigrades are part of every system on Earth, every ecosystem on Earth and in space and everywhere else. And just because we don't pay attention which sometimes things are big and we don't pay attention to them, but if we don't pay attention to things we literally can't see because they're invisible to the naked eye, we're missing a huge part of the story.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's what makes it interesting, to be honest. There's just, we as humans we still have so many things to explore and keep track of and appreciate.
Yeah, for sure. So to the point of the past episode that sort of prefaces this one, which I had a lot of fun and so appreciated your joining for this second part of the conversation, because polar bears, tardigrades are also called water bears, and it's such a funny connection that you would think there's nothing in common between this microscopic, funky animal that has been around for over 500, at least as far as they've even proven so far, over 500 million years, has survived every extinction that has happened that we know of so far, and live everywhere on Earth to polar bears are this adorable, and they actually are both adorable. Who knew, right? Like the microscopic version actually is called a water bear because they're adorable and they look like bears.
Well, it's interesting because when you sent me the information on your last episode, I didn't know about a tardigrade. I looked it up and I had heard of the name of this little microscopic animals. I didn't know they're called tardigrades, but the little something, what is it again?
Water bear.
And if you take a look and get on the web and take a look at what they look like, they do have some sort of.
They even have what looks like fur. They have like hairs. Like there's a better word for it than hairs. Yeah. But like, they have a hair system going like polar bears too.
Yeah. Well, my goodness, the more I learn about nature, the more I realize how similar all living species are, from the very minute to the very biggest. And it doesn't surprise me that there's a it's pretty incredible similarity.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg, the similarity in the way they look on a microscopic versus, we've got one of the smallest animals to one of the largest animals. Funny enough, as a complete aside, the leatherback turtle is runs about the same size as the larger polar bears, which is so that's kind of wild to think that these two different creatures and they're both are in the sea, these enormous and microscopic sea creatures that we don't see. They're invisible to most of us because we don't live in the ocean, right? Like it's just such an important missing piece that we need to pay more attention to. But the comparison, I was doing a comparison between what are the similarities and what are the differences between water bears and polar bears. And I thought it'd be fun to sort of throw this back and forth. If you've got the differences, of course, there's the size, there's the reproduction process, and the community-oriented. A tardigrade is a very solitary microscopic creature. It lives with others, but not in connection in community. It can actually both sexually and asexually reproduce. And then you've got the polar bear, mammal that raises its young and the young is dependent on it. Very different experience in what it needs to survive. And there's other similarities, but then you've got other differences. Then you've got the similarity of the hunkering down, the living in extreme environments, which many tardigrades do in like every extreme environment you can possibly imagine, more than any other creature can survive in. Radiation, all kinds of the deepest, coldest, and hottest places anywhere. And then you've got these two creatures that are so different that know that they have to slow their bodies down and hibernate to get through extreme times. The polar bear hibernates so it slows down. Tardigrade actually shuts down. It actually changes its molecular structure and can live 30 years, whereas it usually lives a few months to a couple of years, but it can survive decades in this frozen state. But the polar bear is pretty impressive that it hibernates and survives it at a much slower pace. So go with that. Like, what did you find was interesting about the connection, the similarities, the differences?
Well, it's amazing. I mean, when you think about, again, I guess the biggest thing that's impressive to me is that a polar bear, even though they're not they can't survive for, let's say, 30 years without doing their normal everyday life stuff like one of these little critters do. I was reading the information where the blood or their blood turns into some kind of material that basically is like an antifreeze.
It's amazing, right?
Yeah. I mean,
and we're learning from it. Like humans are trying to learn from so many species. I mean, biomimicry is such an enormous thing that we're not talking about. We don't realize how much of our existence and progress is based on learning from nature. And now we're trying to learn from tardigrades about.
Yeah. And bears do have a similar mechanism in their body that when they go into hibernation or into the den, and polar bears are a little different than the brown bears and the black bears, where they don't actually go into hibernation, but they do slow down. And I know the other bears have the ability to, not defecate in their dens all winter long. They recycle their urine. They do all kinds of things that we ask ourselves, my goodness, how do they do this? And so there's so many things that we can learn from these animals. And even though the tardigrades are doing something even more miraculous on a smaller level, polar bears are, when you think about where they live and how they have to bring up these baby bears in a den site that outside the den site can be as cold as 50 to 75 below zero, and that's not wind chill. I'm talking about ambient temperatures. Those are pretty miraculous conditions that polar bears have to pull themselves through. And so, I've spent a fair amount of time in the denning areas, a denning area in the Manitoba province of Manitoba in Canada. And I'm always impressed with the fact that we as a photographer have to get out into these conditions.
I'm impressed.
Well, I'm not saying I'm impressed with myself, but I'm saying to be able to function when the bears are living out there. And it's one of the things that it makes me love what I do is part of what is so important and impressive is seeing the conditions these animals live in. And then hearing about some of my brethren complaining about some kind of a difficult situation that they might be in. I had a situation a number of years ago where I was photographing a mother polar bear, and she had one cub that looked like it wasn't feeling well or seemed to be not doing as well as this sibling that she had two cubs. And it was very cold, 20, 30 below zero, I remember. And, the scientists and people who study polar bears talk about how they're made for these conditions and that they've got their fur is hollow, and it helps keep them warm. They have lots of fat, all these things that they talk about as to why they're built to handle these conditions. And I saw this little cub, and it was a cub of the year, meaning he was, had been born that year sometime around January, 1st of January. And so he was in his 7-8 month time in life. And his sibling had climbed up on top of his mom and was cuddled up there on top. And the one on the bottom was on the ground and cuddled up next to her. And he had 1 foot down, and he would sit there, and that's what he would have, that 1 foot down for maybe 5 minutes, and then another 5 minutes go by, and he would pull that foot up and he'd put the second foot down. So it was just a really good example of, he's got to be cold. I mean, his feet have got to be cold, or he wouldn't be picking one up, tucking it in for a while, and then then the other one would get cold, so he'd put that one, tuck it up, put it in his chest, and the other one. And it was just an example of even though they're built for this stuff, they still feel it. Another example.
They have tools. That's resilience. Resilience isn't that it's easy. Resilience is that it's hard. Life is hard, and we need to have tools. And one of the tools that this polar bear cub has is it knows that if it picks its 1 foot up, it'll warm up a little bit and it'll put the other one down. And these are all resilience tools that we learn over time. I don't know if that cub was born with the instinct to do that, or it had figured it out. It picked it up and it was like, oh, this is a little bit warmer. I can still balance.
My guess is they figure it out. I really believe that they can feel it. Another example was Polar Bears International, some work I was doing with them and the San Diego Zoo. And the San Diego Zoo had put in a new exhibit. And by the way, PBI, part of what they work to do with zoos and aquariums is to mandate and help them understand why the exhibits need to be up to a certain level so that these animals can be comfortable. And the San Diego Zoo has an amazing polar bear exhibit. And when they put that thing together, which cost tens of millions of dollars, they filled it up with cold water. The temperature, this is the story I heard, the temperature was similar to what bears would have in the Arctic in the summertime. And it was something like 38 degrees or something like that. And the bears would not get into it. And so they finally started thinking, well, maybe we better warm the water up. So they warmed the water up and finally got it up to if I remember right, 55, 56 degrees. And the bears started using it. But the point is that, they will use that water in the Arctic if they've got to go hunting.
Right.
But
they don't like it.
But they don't love it. It's like, who wants
and they're getting fed. They don't have to be uncomfortable. to get their
That's right.
food. That's so interesting.
But they do feel it. They do feel it. I mean, yeah, they're built for it. And yeah, they got fat and they're built for the cold temperatures. They didn't want to get that 38 degree temperature water.
Oh, that's such a good, and it's such a great story of we have to pay more attention to what's going on and not make these assumptions that life is so simple for other species. They're as complex physically, emotionally, intellectually, like all of the layers that we're underestimating, and to assume that there isn't a complexity to the system and that they're doing things that are all easy is the biggest mistake, right? Like they're surviving by doing hard things, which gets to the human resilience issue. Like we need to do hard things to survive too.
Well, that's exactly true. And it's part of our current situation in our country where we have lots of people, and I mean, I've had discussions with people who talk about being angry and being, all these difficult things that we have going on in their mind. And I say, at least to myself, depending on who I'm talking to, I mean, part of this is my opinion, obviously, what we've experienced is that we've had no serious health scares since the 1930s. Plague has been eradicated. Polio got eradicated. All these things got eradicated. So we have this several generations of people who have no concept of what people all around you may be getting polio, and maybe you. I mean, things like that were
and really poverty to the level that there was before, and violence. Like there's just different levels that.
Well, not only that, World War II. These are all things we've lived through this time since the 1940s that were really, really easy. And this is what I mean when I see a polar bear that is picking its feet up because it's 40 below zero and it's trying to keep its feet warm. And I'm thinking we've had such an easy go since the 1940s, when the end of World War II. We don't even know what really difficult times are. That's my opinion.
No, I agree with you. And in terms of like even the military, like we don't send, as Americans, we don't have the same expectations for putting our youth through tough stuff. Like the military is just one example of that. Like, but there's so much, coddling of the American mind, all of the around that resonance that is leaving younger generations really fragile.
Yes. Agreed.
And that baby polar bear was not as fragile because it had adapted and figured something out.
Yes. And it makes me, how this relates to my life as a wildlife photographer is that it makes me so much appreciate what I have, how easy my life is. Yeah. I worked hard to get to where I'm at. I've been self-employed since I was 16 years old.
You sold your car to get your camera because you needed to have skin in the game. Dad said, I'm not giving it to you. You want it, you got to earn it.
You got it. Right? You want to take it to school, you got to buy your own. I love it. But yeah, exactly. And that's what I love about nature photography is that it gives you the opportunity to see how other creatures really do go through difficult times. And they don't have anybody pulling the punches for them. I mean, and so it makes me grateful, to be honest.
I think it's just so beautiful. There's such a lesson that I keep repeating that I was, this question of how much time do you need to spend in nature to connect and change your mindset around feeling that you're part of nature versus you're watching nature and that you're not dependent on it and it's not dependent on you. Is it 5 minutes? Is it 20 minutes? You had to watch that baby long enough to see it make that move, right? Like you watch it for 5 minutes and you're not going to get the same amount of interaction. You watch it for 20 minutes, you're going to get more because you're going to stop just seeing it as, oh, how cool is that, to, wow, look at the behavior. Like what's the change that's happening? And then you go deeper and you just stay in flow as opposed to the inability for us to focus these days and get into flow without needing a distraction. The challenge, I think, there's a big challenge to our human ability to stay in it.
Yeah.
And that is really damaging our resilience. So the message of hunker down when things are hard, I wrote that and I started with that with during election season. It was like people were just freaking out. Like, what do I do? It's like, okay, don't freak out. Like just slow down. What you have, it's the locus of control issue, right? Like If you don't have control, make sure you vote, do something else, but just calm down and don't burn all the extra energy worrying about things that you have no control over.
Well, I heard you mention that in, I don't know if I read it, or I think I read it in one of your piece that you sent me. And I thought that was really, I mean, it's what my wife and I have discussed for quite, for the last several years, is there's things that we, and she's better at it than I am. There's things that you just cannot control. So don't let it eat you so badly.
But that doesn't mean you don't have permission to do, that you have permission to do nothing. That's the key, right?
There's hitting that happy medium. I don't watch the news as much as I used to.
None of us do, right?
But I'm going to the Capitol tomorrow, day after tomorrow, to rally for public lands here in Montana. And my dear wife, she's such a sweetheart. Part of the reason I love her so much is that she's gentle. She doesn't want, conflict is not her deal. But as I explained to her, there's some things you just got to stand up for. And that's what I do.
Because there's an issue of influence. You might not have control, but you can have influence, and you have to choose your spots.
You do. And I think it's the news cycle that makes most of us, that's so hard for us all to kind of handle. It's crazy lately.
It is crazy. So on the note of resilience, just to sort of wrap it around, because you've been so generous with your time and I so appreciate it. What's coming up for you? Lessons to leave us with a lifetime of just incredible connection and storytelling and really deeply appreciating nature and species in nature as not separate, but part of us. What do we learn? What can we learn?
Anytime I spend time in situations where there are people that aren't wildlife photographers, or let's say aren't professional nature people of some sort, I have never met one that has seen a polar bear or has seen a zebra giving birth or a cheetah, hunting Thompson's gazelle. I've never seen one of them kind of go, let's go. No.
Right. You just stay and watch.
When people have made that commitment to get out, and if you can convince them, hey guys, let's stay. We got to stay. We've been here for 20 minutes, but I'm telling you, this cheetah is on the verge of going hunting. They're floored. I've never seen one of them go, well, that sucked. I mean, we could have been back having a beer at the lodge. No, they don't. I've never seen animals not impress people. They always impress. My last words of wisdom would be, don't give up on nature and do everything you can to bring it home. We're very fortunate here in the West where we have a lot of public property. And that's not just good for us humans, but it's amazing for the animals because it's been set aside, protected, national parks, national refuges, national forests, all these things that help the animals have space to live. And I mean, so give them, support them. You'll never be disappointed.
You'll never be disappointed. Thank you.
It was nice meeting you, and thanks for all the work you're doing. It's great to get people interested in these critters.
Totally. Looking forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.
Right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
There is something grounding about hearing Daniel describe what it means to witness the natural world with patience and respect. As we let those insights settle, this is a beautiful moment to think about how we can carry that same steadiness into our own shifting seasons. As we move through this time of year, a moment when seasons shift in different ways across the world, and when many of us enter the stretch of holidays and new beginnings, life naturally invites reflection. It asks us to notice what is changing around us and within us. It also asks us to choose how we want to meet those changes. This is where the resilience tool of going with the flow becomes especially meaningful. When plans shift or the pace feels uneven, pause for a breath and ask yourself, what is the simplest way I can adapt here? Often that one question softens the moment and makes it easier to move with change rather than brace against it. Seasonal transitions into colder months, warmer months, or simply a new rhythm of light and activity can pull at our energy. So can the intensity of the holiday season. This is a wonderful time to practice conserving your strength, the way polar bears rest on ice between long swims. Notice where you can offer yourself more spaciousness or recovery. You might build a small end-of-day ritual, 1 or 2 minutes of journaling, a short step outside for fresh air, a simple acknowledgement of one way you adapted during the day. These small practices deepen trust in your ability to move with change rather than control it. As the new year approaches, resist the pressure to overhaul everything at once. Instead, ask, what is one small shift I can make that aligns with who I am becoming? Resilience grows through these quiet recalibrations. Share this practice with someone who might need it. Modeling gentler transitions creates a win-win-win. You support your own steadiness, you offer steadiness to someone else, and you strengthen your community. And as we reflect on our own transitions, we cannot overlook the polar bears themselves, the very teachers of today's lesson, and the rapidly shifting world they must navigate. The resilience of polar bears is tied to the health of the sea ice they depend on. That ice is disappearing quickly as the Arctic warms faster than anywhere else on the planet. Melting ice makes it harder for them to hunt, harder to raise their young, and harder simply to survive. We love polar bears for their strength and magnificence, and also for their visibility. They exist vividly in our collective imagination, which means we notice when they struggle, and we will feel their loss deeply if they disappear. Sea ice forms later and breaks up earlier each year. Many mothers cannot build the fat reserves needed to give birth and nurse their cubs. Even when they do find food, pollutants and increasing human activity disrupt their lives. The challenges they face echo the lessons we explored today. The ground beneath them is literally shifting, and adaptation is no longer optional. There is hope. Organizations like Polar Bears International work each day to protect polar bears and the ecosystems they depend on. Supporting conservation efforts, advocating for climate-focused policies, and raising awareness all help strengthen the flows these bears rely on. Together, we can support the resilience of a species that has taught us so much about our own. If today's episode moved you, if it opened something, softened something, or gave you a moment of awe or clarity, please follow, rate, and review Resilience Gone Wild. It helps these stories find the people who may need them most. You can find extended clips, resources, and resilience practices at resiliencegonewild.com, and you can always reach me there. I love hearing how these stories take root in your life and how nature is shaping your own resilience journey. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for choosing to explore the wild wisdom around us. Until next time, stay steady, stay open, stay wild.